Many Russian soldiers have abandoned Russia's efforts to take control of Ukraine. But what happens when a Russian soldier flees? Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been nothing short of a disaster, as he failed to retake the capital, Kiev, in March. His misjudgment has become obvious, and as the war has shifted eastward, and Western weapons have bolstered Ukraine's firepower, Russian casualties have increased to over 500 a day, despite Putin's scorched earth tactics, and the mobilization of over 300,000 Russian conscripts. Ukraine has continued to retake large parts of its territory, and doesn't appear to be stopping anytime soon because of it. Morale among Russian troops is extremely low, according to a recent report by the Institute for the Study of War. At the same time, defections have increased since the invasion began in February, with thousands of young Russians fleeing to countries like Georgia, Turkey, or surrendering to Ukrainian troops. But what happens to these defectors? This could be a disaster for Putin. Russia has a long history of military deserters, in part because of the brutal and inhumane treatment its conscripted soldiers are subjected to. Whenever an army faces war difficulties, poor combat performance, and indifferent leadership, desertion becomes an attractive option. During the disastrous Russo-Japanese, the first weeks of the revolution witnessed desertions of between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers, most of whom were peasants eager to return to their villages. Desertion of badly treated troops has been a recurring pattern in Russian and Soviet history. Soldiers are recruited from poor areas, receive little training or equipment, and are sent to the front lines to face an overwhelming enemy, relying only on quantity of soldiers. Desertions often follow when recruits encounter imminent death in combat or terrible weather conditions. During the First Chechen conflict from 1994 to 1996, Russian soldiers were sent to the front lines in terrible conditions. A 1999 article found that in military hospitals, young recruits told stories of being towed into battle after their armored transports had broken down, of being abandoned by their officers to fend for themselves helplessly, or of living off the land. If this sounds familiar, it is probably because Putin's invasion of Ukraine is making the same mistakes. Already in March, there were reports of Russian troops fleeing, or trying to avoid being sent into battle against Ukraine. Some sabotaged their own equipment and shot down a friendly fighter jet. They refused to fight and carry out orders, and even reportedly ran over one of their own commanders with a tank. When Putin announced the mobilization of military reservists in September, panic spread through the Russian population. Car lines at the border with neighboring Georgia stretched for miles, with Georgian officials claiming that more than 10,000 Russians a day were crossing the border, fleeing Russia. Deserters who avoided being recruited in the first place by fleeing the country are the lucky ones, but their experiences range from uncomfortable to nearly fatal. Some who tried to flee first became involved in protests, but became discouraged or feared for their lives, like Yevgeny, a 28-year-old photographer from Moscow, who now lives in Georgia. After the invasion began, he took part in several anti-war demonstrations, but became demoralized, saying that people were too afraid. They were fully armed and very experienced policemen who knew how to stop the demonstrators. Such demonstrations dissolved because people were scared, and it is not something that gives you hope, Yevgeny reported. He tried to carry on with his life normally after that, but the threat of conscription forced him to leave Russia. Alexander, another man interviewed from the marginalized region of Tatarstan, sold everything he had to pay for the trip to Georgia. A young man named Ivan described supposedly installed police checkpoints, without any approval from higher authorities, clogging the road, occupied by officers seeking bribes. But even after paying 2 bribes, he remained stuck in line, plagued by hunger and fatigue. Finally, convincing an Iranian couple to take him across the border before it was closed to avoid recruiting officers at the border, another young Russian named Volodya carried his suitcase 10 miles to another pass through the mountains on a rainy night and managed to cross on foot. Those with more resources have fled to cities like Istanbul, where airfare prices have skyrocketed and neighborhoods have filled with Russians in many of the places the defectors have fled to. There is also tension with local residents. Some Georgians have claimed that the Russian exiles have colonial attitudes, or that there are also those who fled still supporting Putin, as one woman in The Blaze put it. We see people arriving in Georgia who are against the Russian government. The problem is that it is not just these people who come. There are Russians who support Putin and his regime, but don't want to sacrifice themselves. But because of the horror that awaits them on the battlefield, many who call themselves Russian patriots have avoided joining the invasion. What happens to those who do? For Russians sent to war, desertion becomes much more dangerous. Although Ukrainian President Volodymyr Smolensk has encouraged Russians to surrender, it is said that they will be treated in a civilized manner. Much of the danger comes from their own country. Russian soldiers said they felt deceived or threatened into fighting. In one video, Ukrainian soldiers interrogate a Russian officer and ask what message he wants to send to those at home. Frankly speaking, they deceived us. Everything they told us was a lie. I would tell my boys to leave Ukrainian territory. We have families and children. I think 90% of us would agree to go back home. But despite sentiments like that, attempts to desert the battlefield often mean death, especially for conscripts. Recent reports from the UK Ministry of Defense found that Russia has begun using troops called barrier troops, or blocking units. These are troops stationed behind new recruits, whose job is to shoot anyone who turns their back and runs away. According to the report, Russian generals ordered their officers to hold positions until death. Ukrainian intelligence recently released an intercepted phone call between a Russian soldier and his wife, where he tells her the following: "We sit on the second line, guarding the first line behind us. The other line, if you go that way, you won't get there either, so it's impossible to escape." They shoot. Their own officers face the same threats. A reporter on Telegram found that Russian General Alexander Lapin personally pulled out a pistol and pointed it at the head of a commander supervising the conscripted troops who had retreated in Luhansk, threatening to shoot if the unit did not return to the front line. Many of those who have tried to escape are conscripted inmates, who are usually put on the front lines as cannon fodder. These inmates are given false hopes of pardon if they enlist, despite leaked private statements from Yevgeny Dangerous, in chief of the Wagner Group militia, and the man in charge of the scheme to recruit inmates in Russian prisons, that for the inmates, it is not a pardon, but a death sentence. In October, Ukraine's Army General Staff reported that Russian inmates who are sent to fight often flee their units and try to return to Russian territory after receiving weapons in late December. The bodies of more than 20 Russian soldiers, most of them former prisoners, were discovered in Donetsk. Some of the defecting soldiers managed to escape, such as 27-year-old Nikita Chebrin from Siberia, who was given manual labor jobs. After criticizing the war to a superior, he managed to escape in a food supply vehicle and eventually fled to Spain, where he now seeks asylum. What about the families that are left behind in Russia by deserters? Many of the thousands of men who have fled the country, or died trying, have been forced to leave their wives and families to avoid the draft. One woman interviewed named Daria, who works as a copywriter, helped her husband flee to Kazakhstan. When the mobilization was announced and she stayed to keep her job, she stayed in the country saying, "I don't even want to think about the fact that I am here and he is there. It is very difficult and sad." But she, like many others, was glad that her husband was able to escape, since in Russia, there is a feeling that everything is getting bad as the war continues into the new year. Each time more Russian troops may desert or face the prospect of freezing to death, and as that happens, it will put even more strain on Putin's resources. While this may not mean the end of the war anytime soon, the long-term implications of so many defections could be overwhelming. Russia is already suffering from brain drain, as more and more highly skilled people leave the country for other places. Large amounts of defections also likely mean that Russia will not be able to gain much territory, and may even lose the territories of eastern Ukraine, still under Putin's control. Mass defections have toppled Russian governments in the past, and it is still possible that enough of them could force even a leader as ruthless as Putin to end this war. Either way, the status of Russian defectors will likely remain controversial. Still, those who see no other option will continue to flee, believing that, as one man put it, action now would mean likely death later. But what do you think? Russian soldiers will continue to abandon Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and this could potentially be fatal to the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war. Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to sign up for more military analysis from experts on the subject.